Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is the very first episode of the Not Censored Yet podcast series, where I talk about things that make me say, what the right? So, this is a bill being proposed in the state of New York, which has garnered a lot of press, well, in conservative circles, right? I'm not sure if it hit mainstream, but it's definitely in the podcasts. A lot of the not not the mainstream people are talking about it, but I guess the subculture is talking about it, basically going, "Hey, this is crazy that the government is even considering this." And what kind of the reason why I'm talking about it is a lot of people are only talking about what's going on the first and second page. And the first and second page, if you really don't know what's going on about it, basically talks about how if that it's the provisions that the government declares a state of health emergency due to an epidemic of any communicable disease, which for me, that is super vague. Any communicable disease. What is a disease? And there's been arguments being made in the past couple weeks, and actually in the past year, with the rise in protests, with even being considered a greater racism, systematic or systemic racism being a greater threat, greater public health threat than COVID 19, which is bananas considering that we're reaching 400,000 deaths in the United States. So, you know, they say communicable disease. I read into that could be the cold, the flu, or disease of thought. And that is what concerns me the most. And I'll kind of hammer that nail later down. But what a lot of people are talking about is so it's not only if you have the disease, it's if you're suspected of having it, right? So maybe you came into contact with somebody that may have had it. So your delivery man or delivery woman, your delivery person delivered a package. They tested positive for a disease that they're detaining people for. So, guess what, friend? We're going to have to detain you until we know whether or not you are sick. So, and rightfully so, that is very concerning, right? So, imagine walking down the street and, we all have these little GPS trackers in our pocket and they say, hey, we geotagged you next to somebody who is sick. We're going to have to detain you because you may be sick as well. That's bananas. And they don't need to prove that you're sick. It's the strangest part. You don't have to show symptoms. You don't even have to have a positive test. It's if they suspect that you are at risk of being sick. That's the issue. And that's what's personally concerns me the most. I don't know about y'all, but I personally like my freedoms. But where I'm going to start getting into this is where the rules to get out and the in the what they can do to you while you're in, because that's what bothers me the most. And I'm going to take this from the position of a homeless veteran, homeless person. When a person or group is offered to be detained pursuant to subdivision 2 of this section for a period not exceeding 3 business days, such person or member of such group shall, upon request, be afforded an opportunity to be heard. If a person or group detained pursuant to subdivision 2 of this section needs to be detained beyond 3 business days, they shall be provided with an additional commissioner's order pursuant to subdivisions 2 and 8 of this section. So, if they're only going to hold you for a couple days for observation, you have a right to complain. You have the right to say, hey, I don't want to be in here. But earlier on, they talked about where they can keep you for up to 5 business days after that. Anyway, when a person or group is ordered to be detained pursuant to subdivision 2 of this section for a period exceeding 3 business days, and such person or member of such group requests release, The governor or his or her delegee shall make an application for a court order authorizing such detention within 3 business days after such request by the end of the first business day following such Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, which application shall include a request for an expedited hearing. So, the way I read that, I can read that in 2 ways. It's either they will file the paperwork that first business day after the weekend. So if you request that on a Monday, they have to file the paperwork by the first business day of the following week, or they have 3 business days to do that. It's sort of ambiguously written. And I think there's a lot of ambiguous writing in this bill, which is scary because you are asking the government to interpret something that's giving them a whole lot of power. Notwithstanding the foregoing provisions, in no event shall any person be detained for more than 60 days without a court order authorizing such detention. So, again, I'm going to go to I'm a homeless veteran and I live under a bridge or I live in a tent. I don't necessarily always have a meal to eat. It's cold out right now in New York. So they go, hey, sir, we believe that you may be sick. Why don't you go ahead and come into this healthcare detention facility? Am I going to turn that down? Free 2 months of 3 hots and a cot, TV to watch most likely? Probably not. And considering that I have most likely no family to reach out to, and no one's going to know where I'm at. And again, that's the nail I'm going to hammer on here in a little bit, but it's bananas. The governor or his or her delegee shall seek further court review of such detention within 90 days following the initial court order authorizing detention, and thereafter within 90 days of each subsequent court review. How long do they expect to keep people detained? Which communicable disease takes longer than 90 days to treat? This is where I believe that it's not just a sickness or a physical manifestation of sickness. I think they might be going over mental health issues, what they deem as sickness. So I think ideas of thought is going to be considered a sickness. A great example would be this whole, and I'm going to be doing an episode on this in the next day or two, the whole argument of multiracial whiteness. I'm second generation American from a Cuban immigrant. And if I voted for Joe Biden, I would be considered a good Hispanic voter, voting for the tolerant left, voting for basically tolerance, anti-fascism, blah, blah, blah. And if I had voted for Trump, I would be seen as someone embracing multiracial whiteness, adopting the white supremacy culture, and definitely a problem, which is weird considering that if I vote against the way one group believes me. So I'm not even going to go into that analysis, but I will say it seems extremely racist that if you vote against what you're considered to should be voting for, that you are just a white supremacist. You are exhibiting the traits of multiracial whiteness, and you're not necessarily rejecting groupthink, or you're thinking for yourself. Maybe you just project the cultural aspect of voting a certain way. Maybe you go, hey, I read this person's policy and I wanted to vote that way. So it's crazy what they're doing right now. And people need to be aware of what's going on. And that's why I'm doing the show, actually. In any court proceeding to enforce an order of the governor or his or her delegee for the removal or detention of a person or group issued pursuant to this subdivision, or for review of the continued detention of a person or group, The governor or his or her delegee shall prove the particularized circumstances constituting the necessity for such detention by clear and convincing evidence. So, that clear and convincing evidence is this health crisis is a thing. This is contagious. Again, thoughts are contagious. I've read news articles where Trumpism is contagious. So, don't think it's just the cold. Don't just think it's the flu. Don't just think it's X, Y, or Z. It could be whatever the narrative of the day is. That clear and convincing evidence is, hey, this is contagious. There is a X% chance that they have it. We need to keep them detained because if this gets out, we're in one, it's say if this was in New York City, hey, we're in one of the most populated, densely populated cities in the USA, and we can't run the risk of this spreading like wildfire. We need to shut it down. And the courts are most likely going to agree with the government as opposed to the individual. A copy of any detention order of the governor or his or her delegee issued pursuant to subdivision 2 of this section shall be given to each detained individual. However, if the order applies to a group of individuals and it is impractical to provide individual copies, it may be posted in a conspicuous place in the detention premises. Any detention order of the commissioner issued pursuant to subdivision 2 of this section shall be set forth. So it's insane. They foresee a situation where there's going to be so many people detained that they just can't give individual copies out. So how big is this threat that they're seeing? Why is it so vague? Why is it so ambiguous? Why is it so amorphous? It could just be anything you want it to be. The purpose of this detention and the legal authority under which the order is issued, including the particular sections of this article or law or regulation. So this is basically what's on that piece of paper. A description of the circumstances and or behavior of the detained person or group constituting the basis for the issuance of this order. That is a nail. I am the hammer. I shall hammer that in a second. The less restrictive alternatives that were attempted and were unsuccessful, and or the less restrictive alternatives that were considered and rejected, and the reasons such alternatives were rejected. So you protested lockdowns, you opened your restaurant, you went to work, all of these things, they would say, hey, the less restrictive alternatives were stay at home, shut up. We will pay you $1,000 over the course of a year, and that should be enough for you to live, right? A notice advising the person or group being detained that they have a right to request release from detention, and including instructions on how such request shall be made. A notice advising the person or group being detained that they have a right to be represented by legal counsel, and that upon request of such person or group, access to counsel will be facilitated to the extent feasible under the circumstances. And a notice advising the person or group being detained that they may supply the addresses and or telephone numbers of friends and or relatives to receive notifications of the person's detention, and that the department shall, at the detained person's request, and to the extent feasible, provide notice to a reasonable number of such people that the person is being detained. So you have to tell the government to tell people that you're being detained. It is not their responsibility to tell them for you. It's basically what it comes down to. In addition, an order issued pursuant to subdivisions 2 and 7 of this section requiring the detention of a person or group for a period exceeding 3 business days shall advise the person or group being detained that the detention shall not continue for more than 5 business days after a request for release has been made in the absence of a court order authorizing such detention. So even if the courts don't give a response, they can still keep you for a week. Advise the person or group being detained that whether or not they request release from detention, the governor or his or her delegees must obtain a court order authorizing detention within 60 days following the commencement of detention, and thereafter must further seek court review of the detention within 90 days of such court order and within 90 days of each subsequent court review. So, again, going to the homeless veteran analogy, if I'm a homeless veteran, it is January in New York, it is hella cold. Why am I going to complain? Why am I going to say, hey, I want to build an igloo and try to stay warm through the frigid winter? No, I'm going to be sound as a pound in there and honestly hope that they're going to extend it. I might actually say, hey, I licked somebody's mucus because I just want to pretend to be sick. And that's a hammer or that's a nail, and I will hammer that nail farther in a bit. Advise the person or group being detained that they have the right to request the legal counsel be provided, that upon such request, counsel shall be provided if and to the extent possible under the circumstances. That is a problem. If you're going to detain so many people that you don't have enough legal personnel to represent them, then you should not be detaining people, because most people don't understand their rights. Most people don't understand arguments to be made for their civil rights in the court of law, while making that argument, basically stating, hey, this violates my right as a person. I shouldn't be detained for no reason. That's actually against, it goes against even the Bill of Rights. So if there's not enough attorneys to represent those detained, then either A, find more attorneys, or B, detain less people. A person who is detained in a medical facility or other appropriate facilities or premises, that's hilarious. So you can be detained in a medical facility or a juvenile detention center, a prison, any place that they see fit, shall not conduct himself or herself in a disorderly manner, and shall not leave or attempt to leave such facility or premises until he or she is discharged pursuant to this section. So it's nice that they believe that there's only a finite number of genders. I wonder what happens if you fall in between those two and you try to leave, because guess what? I suppose the rules don't apply to you anymore. Jumping down to section 12. In addition to the removal or detention orders referred to in subdivision 2 of this section, and without affecting or limiting any other authority that the commissioner may otherwise have, the governor or his or her delegee may, in his or her discretion, issue and seek enforcement of any other orders that he or she determines are necessary or appropriate to prevent dissemination or transmission of contagious diseases or other illnesses that may pose a threat to the public health, including, but not limited to, orders requiring any person or persons who are not in the custody of the department to be excluded. So that is a extremely long sentence, basically stating that they can use whatever means within their discretion to squelch the spread of a contagion. And that's crazy, because if they can force mandates, so this goes earlier up, right? So if they say, hey, you didn't follow the less restrictive orders, so now we're detaining you. So now they can enact and enforce a mandate for masks, for lockdowns, for not opening restaurants, for not opening your store, for not walking down the street, for not going to work. So for all those things, those were considered. This would be those less restrictive requirements put in place before that detainment. And this gives him kind of him or her carte blanche to create whatever set of less restrictive rules to create that trap for you to break those rules and then detain you. To remain isolated or quarantine at home or at a premises of such person's choice that is acceptable to the department, and under such conditions and for such periods as will prevent transmission of the contagious disease or other illnesses. So again, this is just the less restrictive aspect. to require the testing or medical examinations of persons who may have been exposed to or infected by a contagious disease. And that's a really big issue. So they're forcing medical examinations for someone who may be sick, who may have been exposed to a disease. Um, in medical ethics, there's this thing called consent and autonomy. And arguably, if these communicable diseases are that bad, you're not even in a place to where you possess the autonomy to give that consent. So they're taking away your rights as an individual, as a citizen of the United States. They're taking away those rights and they're treating you like a prisoner. And then it also talk about radioactive materials or toxic chemicals. That, I believe, is going to be a little different if you've been exposed to radioactive materials or toxic chemicals, because most likely you're going to be incapacitated, and they might have to actually treat you, which is still going to be in the medical ethics realm. If you're unconscious, then they have to do whatever's in the best interest of you. So if you're exposed with dangerous amounts of radioactive materials, you may not actually be conscious anymore. So that I agree with, I suppose, depending on the case. To require an individual who has been exposed to or infected by a contagious disease to complete an appropriate prescribed course of treatment, preventative medication, or vaccination, including directly observed therapy to treat the disease and follow infection control provisions for the disease. So, you have to follow the medical protocols. You have to receive the vaccinations and medications you're supposed to receive, and directly observed therapy. So this is what bugs me. Directly observed therapy. What is that? So, like I said, people are conflating, I suppose would be the right word, racism, white supremacy. They're saying that that's worse than COVID-19. They're saying that that's a greater public health threat. So imagine if we can detain them and the prescribed course of treatment is direct observed therapy to treat that whiteness, to treat that multiracial whiteness that they possess. And that's bananas, because you're forcing them to receive that treatment. Or further down, you're not forcing them. The court order, the state will receive a court order basically giving them permission to administer that treatment. I'll explain kind of how I think that's going to run. So here in a minute, but imagine the state saying that you have flim-flam disease and the course of treatment for that is a lobotomy, and the courts say, okay, and guess what? The state's going to start performing lobotomies, and you have no say in the matter. You're not in prison. You're just sick. And you may not even be sick. It just may be they say you're sick. And that's the biggest thing. So, it was a horrible movie, but one of the latest Aliens versus Predator movies, where they said that the son who had autism's not a disease, it's just the next step in evolution. So everybody treated the little kid like he was less than instead of greater than, where the aliens saw that as a jump in the progress of human evolution. So I know that's a bad movie and that may be a bad example, but one person's what's considered a sickness to one person, or maybe to an entire field, from an outside observer might say that's actually the next step of where humans are going to go. That's actually going to be the norm. And it's extremely dangerous when you say, hey, that's a public health threat. What happens if that's just the next stage of evolution? We don't know. Such person or persons shall, upon request, be afforded an opportunity to be heard, but the provisions of subdivisions 2 through 11 of this section shall not otherwise apply. So you have the right to be heard, but you don't have a right to an attorney. That's the way I read that, because sections 2 through 11 basically talk about how you have access to legal representation to fight your case for detention, but that those provisions through 2 through 11 won't apply. So you have to argue your case on your own without assistance, which is bananas. 13. The provisions of this section shall not be construed to permit or require the forcible administration of any medication without a prior court order. And what's important about that, folks? You have 10,000 cases of flim-flam disease, and we need to treat that. Do you think the court wants to listen to 10,000 individual court cases as to why this person shall receive this treatment? No, they will sign a court order basically stating that if the state is treating case of flim-flam disease, they are prescribed treatment X, Y, and Z. And in that X, Y, and Z could be horrible, horrible things. But as long as the state can make a reasonable argument before the court as to why those treatments are necessary, then the court says, well, then it's justified for you to do those treatments to cure the disease or treat the disease to protect society at large. And that's where I think if you want to go tinfoil cap here, that's where you see the real strange things happening, because judges aren't doctors, doctors aren't judges. Those don't mesh. Each one of those are going to entrust that the other is operating in good faith. We saw this a couple years ago with the whole Russiagate conspiracy, correct? When FBI agents doctored documents stating that people basically lying to the FISA court judges, and the judges had to take that information on good faith. The judges couldn't interrogate the investigators. They had to assume that the investigators were doing their job and not lying. And the same thing's going to have to go with these judges. These judges are going to have to trust the word of the medical professionals and of the government that are requesting these treatments. And that's extremely dangerous, because you don't know if treatment X, Y, and Z, they could be the most drastic procedures, right? Maybe they're not the first order. Maybe it's not the emergency you take when you are sick. Maybe it's not the orange juice you take when you were out in the cold and you got wet. So maybe it's straight to the most extreme medical intervention you can get. And the court's going to have to take that in good faith that the people representing the state and representing those medical officials are being honest with them, being forthcoming. And I don't see that being the case. Government, when provided carte blanche power, they take advantage of that. And with as loosely written as this document is, you can interpret this so many ways. This can be this. I don't even see a way how this is considered a good thing, because imagine a world that they just believe that you're sick and they can detain you, and you have to argue before a court that you're not sick, that you're not contagious, that the person that you talked to wasn't sick. The burden's on you. In every other court case, right? If this was a criminal case, the burden is on the state to prove that you're guilty. On this one, the burden's on you to prove that you're innocent. And that is extremely dangerous, because most people don't have the wherewithal, the ability to read a document and go, holy God, this is scary what the state is asking for here. And people who don't have the best of intentions will use laws like this to beat you over the head into submission. They will use laws like this to get rid of their opposition. So, perfect example, you have a political opponent. Sorry, I'm just looking to see how long this was running for. So you have Chuck Schumer running for re-election for Senate. People have been floating the idea for AOC to run against him, to primary him out of that election. And so imagine if AOC holds a rally and Chuck Schumer and the governor of New York, Cuomo, are buddies. And Schumer goes, "Hey, I heard her event was a super spreader event. I heard there were some people that may have been sick there." And Cuomo just detains everybody that was associated with that event, anybody who went to that event. And guess what? Her popularity is going to go way down because they're going to know if they support her, they're going to be detained. And that's an extreme use case, but it is definitely a possibility. It seems like a good way to squelch any and all ideological opposition. And that's why it's written so vague that I don't even consider that a crackpot theory. It's definitely a possibility with arguments that have been being made through the mainstream media, through politicians. And that's not left field. That's definitely a possibility. And that concerns me. And hopefully you learn something from that. So if you like to, go ahead and hit that like button, hit that subscribe button as well. If you enjoy the show, you like what you're seeing, you can go to notcensoredyet.com/donate. That'll help me out. There's some crypto links and some fiat currency links there as well. So that's going to be it for today. See y'all later.